I'm for managed disruption. I also look after an ecosystem for disruptors, and that's called Pathfinder. I worked for Forrester as an advisor to leaders of large companies for almost a decade. And so what we're going to talk about today is the disruption that I've seen out there and that I see happening. And then we're going to get 3 CIOs to come up here and tell you what they see, because I think it's quite interesting. We've heard a lot about blockchain in theory, we've heard a lot about the governance, but let's also think about what this really means. So before we get into that, here are 3 of my favorite people. I was in a room with them not that long ago, and I don't know if anybody recognizes any of these people who are up here. They belong to some pretty important companies on the whole. They represent these companies. And what I found really interesting was that one of the companies completely blindsided the other 2. So who's heard of Geo in the room? Oh, a couple of people. Okay, so very few people have actually heard of Geo, but they're a fascinating company because they are so disruptive. As you can imagine from the other people in here, they're in the telecoms market. They sell SIMs and access to telephone network in India. They also do things a little bit differently. And so when I was sitting talking to the people in the room, the guy from Geo, Dr. Stefan, said, well, yeah, we have this interesting thing that's happening. And basically he said, we're taking on 1.5 million new customers every day. And you could see the other 2 guys go, what? And it was a real it was a bit of a shock to them, because this is a startup which is completely taking that market by storm. And they've been doing this since about September. They want to get 100 million new customers in 100 days. Okay, so this is telecoms, not that much to do with blockchain, but I think what I wanted to show it to you for was because this is about the sort of disruption that potentially you guys could do. Because the way in which they actually do this, it's about biometrics. I don't know if you know, but the Indian government is very focused on replacing cards and using biometrics instead of cash, instead of any other way of doing business. And they also have this very antiquated law about, well, not antiquated, a rather difficult and cumbersome rules about the fact that if you want a telephone, you have to prove you're not a terrorist, which means you have to prove who you are. And in India, that takes multiple forms. What Geo actually figured out was, hey, we'll use this new infrastructure and we'll open up the demand, because the demand was sitting there, massive demand. And in a lot of ways, this is exactly what blockchain should be about. It should be about opening up a new demand that's there. And what I've been hearing, certainly today, is a lot of use cases which open up a little bit, a lot which are kind of interesting. None that are really revolutionary at the moment, and maybe that's not what we need. Maybe, maybe that's not where we're at the moment. And in a minute, we're going to talk to some CIOs who should give you a real-world view of how difficult it will be to actually use the blockchain in real businesses. So these two gentlemen here, what do they do when they come to see that they're about to be disrupted? Well, they can try and buy the disruptor. It's going to be a little difficult, nobody wants to sell. Or they can copy them, or partner with them, or block them, or mobilize themselves to disrupt. Well, as you can imagine, it's a bit late to do that. Or they could look for another job. And basically, in disruption, that's kind of the choices you've got. That's where it goes, apparently. It certainly seems to be the case. If you ignore the problem, you get crushed. So what is the problem? I talk about disruptive innovation all the time, and I think I ought to explain what it is. Earlier today, we saw the idea of the horses. If I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, said Henry Ford. Absolutely right. So how many of the solutions, the use cases that you're thinking about are faster horses? How many is just doing it that little bit better? Not doing something that actually taps into a pent-up need. That's the difficulty. If you look at those 2 lovely cars up there, one from 2000 and one from 2016, they look kind of similar, don't they? And that's another sort of innovation. It's an innovation that it really, so what? Unless I'm actually really keen on that extra button that sits in the latest BMW, am I going to buy it? Well, maybe. The other sort of innovation is about efficiency innovation, and we've talked about that a lot. I think blockchain is really good for getting rid of multiple databases, lots of efficiency savings. That's a good thing. What it doesn't do is it doesn't create any jobs, and there are limits to it. Once you've actually got it as efficient as you can get it, a process, that's it. That's the end of the road. You have to think about doing something else. So I think as a leader of a business, I'd say, that's good, let's do that. But what's next? What comes after that? And so certainly chase that sort of innovation right now, but certainly keep your mind on where that innovation is going to go in the future. Okay, so the other bit about innovation is that you actually have to hit in the sweet spot of these three things. And one thing I haven't heard about is desirability. Nobody actually talks about how desirable is this thing that's going to happen. You know, the Geo example is great because those people really want a phone and they'll line up. This is a manual process, of course, because they have to put their fingerprints on it. They'll line up to do it in their millions. How desirable is the blockchain app or use case that you're actually looking at the moment? Not just how much money will it save and is it viable? That's the real test. Is the desirability of what you're doing. Desirability also inside your organization. And when I say your organization, you can tell I'm used to talking to CIOs of large companies rather than entrepreneurs. Because desirable in a large organization means actually I get to keep my job. That's pretty desirable. And a blockchain can be a big negative to that. That's what you have to be careful of. If you come up against that sort of competition from the inside, they'll shoot you down. You won't have a chance. You won't even get to talk to anybody about how great your solution is. So you have to think about the desirability for the company as well. Another thing is, I'm sure you all recognize this adoption curve here. Very standard adoption curve, only the world doesn't work like that anymore. The world works like this for a lot of things. So what I'm saying here is that people change. This is the adoption curve of this little tool here, which is an HTC Vive. Now, the HTC Vive sold 15,000 units in the first 10 minutes at about £750 each. Massive, lots of money, great. Probably didn't sell that many after the first 10 minutes because everybody who wanted one had already bought one. And that's the problem. It's very high adoption and then it drops away. So as you're thinking of your use cases, you need to think about the way the end users buy and use what you're doing, because that's changed. So many companies are set in the past about the way in which people use what they're doing or what they can do. And yet, because of technology, consumers have changed radically and they keep on changing, and they will keep on changing. But most companies are actually stuck in the past, trying to solve the use cases of yesterday. Don't do that. Really, don't do that. It doesn't help. What you do find is, I said most companies, some companies are very different. You get exponential companies that are 10 times faster, cheaper, and all these sort of things. And they really do exist. I was a bit shocked. So you all know LinkedIn. You're probably all members of LinkedIn, along with the 490-something million other people. Did you realize that they only have 1,500 employees, 1,500 employees for 490 million customers? Not a lot. The other real scary bit I found was of those 1,500 employees, only 10, that's 10 of them are over the age of 40. Everybody else is young, and the average age is 24. So you can think they are super young, and they do things completely differently to the way we do things. So, you know, right now you need to build for the big companies, the big banks, whoever your customer is. But think about these exponential companies who do stuff differently. Because not only are they are very different, but they do things very differently. You know this fail fast idea? It's not an idea. That's exactly what they do all the time. And so if you can find a customer like that, I suggest go and get them. Don't get the people who are the legacy in most cases. So why a blockchain solution? And I think this is really understanding what the blockchain enables and the problem that it's going to solve. And please stop thinking about the problems that are there today. Yes, certainly that'll bring you the bread and butter that'll keep your company going, that'll get you out there. But think about the next step. Think about what people will want. Think about what the pent-up demand is. And I don't hear a lot of that, and that's a pity. That's what you really need to be focusing on, is where you're going with this stuff. I mean, there's stuff like the blockchains around diamonds, for instance. Never been done before. Great idea. Kind of simple, but not a bad idea at all. A lot of other ideas are too simple. So I'll just end on this, an action plan, what you should be doing. Well, step one, you should decide how you're going to innovate. You're going to decide where you're going to do it, prepare your company, and then get some help. Easy. Everybody can do this. Getting help, however, may not be that easy. And I do suggest, this is the other area that I work in, is in an ecosystem for innovators, of getting disruptive innovators together. And you can all join this. This is a place where you can meet people who will produce funding, will produce ideas for you, will produce use cases, because there are customers in this space as well. And they'll also give you all that other elements that you need. So I'm going to leave it at that, because I really want to invite up the three CIOs that we have today, if you'd like to come and join us. So these gentlemen, I'll get them to introduce themselves in a second. They are real live CIOs who have real live responsibilities in big companies. And I'll get them to represent what fields they come from, because what we're going to do is discuss some of the, well, what blockchain looks like if you happen to be the chief information officer of a large company. So, Michael, if you'd like to start by introducing yourself.
Sure, I'm Michael Harris, and I'm a CIO of a large Lloyd's managing agent. So Lloyd's Insurance is a specialist insurance market. So we insure all sorts of things, from fleets of aviation, catastrophe risk, in Florida and other places, through a very traditional mechanism from the Lloyd's building in the city.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ricky Crawford. I'm a CIO from the telco and fintech industries. Nowadays, I'm more involved with the stuff that Mark's doing around disruption. So I work with organisations to help them put in blockchain, understand the integration elements around it, understand how to productionise and operationalise any new disruptive technology.
Hello, my name is Gareth Ash. I'm an interim CIO and consultant in the professional services industry. I spent the last 14 years in and around the legal industry, mainly working for major global legal organisations. And I've spent my time moving around different firms, putting in new technologies, helping them to restructure and reorganise their businesses.
Thank you. So we thought, rather than get in here and just ask some questions and each of us answer them in turn, maybe we'd start kind of a little mini debate if we could. So that's where we're going to start. So I think if I throw out the question of, how is blockchain considered in your firm and in your industry? I think that might be a good place to start. So,
I think if I asked my business, what do you think of blockchain, they'd ask me what that was. Would probably be the starting point. It's quite interesting. I think if you ask CIOs in the insurance industry, it's about the fifth item on the list in terms of priority. Fifth priority is blockchain, and what does this mean to the business? But if you ask my particular business, they don't either know what it is or can't really see how it could be applied to them.
And why do you think the CIO has a different view?
I think the CIO is the person responsible in the business really for looking forward and working out what's coming and how you can keep what you've got running, but also how you can keep the business alive, seize those Darwin moments, and really evolve as things move forward. So a very different agenda and outlook on things, whereas I think in the pure business, certainly if you talk to our underwriters, it's all about signing that next risk. What happened last year, what's going to happen next year, and what's the premium going to be? Different outlook.
Right. And would you say, Ricky, that this is a strategy thing, that this is what you do? Or is it more than that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely what a CIO does nowadays. A CIO going from a traditional technologist that's looking at software, looking at hardware, to actually build and integrate. This is now more about strategy. It's now more about running a business from a technology perspective. I think that the points that Michael's raising is absolutely right. For me to actually bring new technology into the business, it's great that I know and understand it. It's great my technical teams know and understand it. But actually, I need the investment and the funding from my board to be able to make it happen. That's the challenges that we have to face today, and that's a lot of what my role is about. The role is about actually helping the board understand the benefits of technology, the benefits of blockchain in particular, and what the use cases are around it.
And I think the world has changed, hasn't it? A lot, really. In terms of technology, used to be this thing you had to have. It did some stuff for you, it did some automation for you, but you tell the IT department what you need, whereas I think technology is moving now and should be that partner at the table helping the strategy.
Absolutely, I agree. I think the great analogy around this is if you all think back to cloud computing within an industry, within a business. We spoke about this earlier on, and actually that's a real-life example for blockchain today. With the cloud, you do it in-house, do you do it externally, do you get it hosted? You've always got this buy and build strategy to think about. That buy and build strategy is about where you're going to invest your money in the organisation. This is exactly the same now. I think with blockchain, because you've got a permission versus an internal type of system within blockchain as well, you can decide, do you want to do it internally, do you want to do it externally? And we've got these same debates that are going on now that clearly, as Mark says, they're only number 5 on the list, but they're actually going up the list. And they're going to become more prevalent over the next sort of 6-12 months going forward.
And I think the bit I want to add from certainly the legal perspective is you're very much as a CIO looking at the same as my colleagues here, internally at the way you're running the systems, but also the partner with the business. The one thing with the law, and I'm not saying on the internal systems are always at the cutting edge, I'm happy to go public on that one. But
we actually agree with you, by the way.
But what you're finding with new technology is the part the law has to play, and that's the bit as a CIO you have to really stay on top of, because often the lawyers are coming to you to talk about the perspective that the clients are going to have. If you think of blockchain, it's all about rules and governance around trade, ownership and trust, and that's at the nexus is where the legal industry operates as well. So there's definitely going to be a partnership or a collision course, whichever your viewpoint is, of the way that the law is going to work with, hopefully not against blockchain, but again, I agree, it's exactly that same trajectory we're seeing with cloud. There's going to be people who are in the less regulated industries where they're happy to take more risk. Just spoke to a gentleman now from Save the Children, I think, who's experimenting with blockchain. I know within law and financial services is going to be a lot more of a steady watching what happens, sort out the regulation, what happens with cross-border, etc., etc., etc. So it's going to be that same trajectory as cloud, but very much as a CIO in legal, you find you're often working with the thought leaders, the subject matter experts, who are starting to look at blockchain from that governance and the legal frameworks that are going to have to enshrine it for it to actually really take off.
And there's a lot of big companies that see the value in this in the tech world. So I know Accenture have just set up a blockchain practice for the financial services industry. So clearly they recognise that this has huge potential. I know that Lloyd's Insurance have gone on record as saying that they can see the value, certainly that distributed databases would have to the industry. And the CEO at XL Catlin has said that he sees absolute opportunity for his organisation in terms of this particular technology. So it's definitely here to stay, but it's at that very early stage, and I think the regulation, to your point, is really going to be the thing that we as CIOs have to look out for, particularly with data protection and
I think
changes,
the regulation point, just picking up on a previous speaker earlier on, that they were talking about sandbox within the FCA, both in London and in Singapore. As a CIO, that concerns me a little bit. Not because we're actually getting development done and we're actually enhancing the product and what the product's going to look like, but actually it's taking away the ownership of my business and what the target operating model of my business looks like. We're now in cahoots with a regulator, and actually the regulator is now dictating what I should and should not do. That worries me from a CIO perspective. I think the guys would probably sort of agree with that as well, hopefully.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's always worrying when the regulator tells you what to do, though.
Absolutely.
It's better to get there first.
If they do that, then you're in trouble anyway, I think.
So in terms of the minimum requirements, I mean, in a lot of cases, well, we've all been using technology for many years, and there's certain requirements that have to be met before you let technology into your data center or into your cloud, or at least your users use it. How do you feel about blockchain in relation to that at the moment? Is it fit for purpose?
I think that's a leading question, actually, but certainly in this environment. From my perspective, I don't think it is fit for purpose yet. I think it's got a little while to go. I don't see, and I haven't heard of particularly many use cases around it. Clearly, Bitcoin, separate entity entirely, but that's a completely separate thing. I think if you look at commercializing blockchain, there is 0 cases I can see that are tangible for any businesses that I would want to work in and implement it in as an integration in there. So I think there is more development to be done. I think the more it becomes public knowledge about what it can do and the benefits of it, particularly around the security and around the trust side of it as well, I think is going to be great. My concern around that is that as technology evolves further on 5 years down the line, you start to talk about neural networks, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. All of a sudden, another concern, I don't mean to be the pessimist around blockchain because I'm absolutely not, but it's a pragmatic, realistic concern that quantum computing, once you bring that into the fray with all of this, everything that is secure and trusted with crypto today becomes game on. That's the big worry for me going forward.
And I think, as you mentioned earlier, it's trying to get that board buy-in.
Yeah.
And boards run on numbers. So if you don't have a good use case with a good business case behind it to invest in the technology that's required to do it, and you can't answer some simple questions around where is my data, how secure is my data, do we meet the legal requirements, then I think that's a really big problem.
I think, ironically, internally, if you were just to host a blockchain just to run some internal functions, that would be quite doable because you would not have all those issues. However, it's still very immature. I certainly agree with my colleagues here. We're at the very beginning of that hype cycle. You know, it's in its infancy, and that must be year 1 rather than year 6 or 7, whatever the end of the infancy is. However, in terms of its use cases and where it's going, certainly within the legal context, you know, I think it's got an incredible future. It's not there in terms of its level of maturity now, but when you start thinking of smart contracts, and if you think a mortgage, a will, a share, a patent, all these things are enshrined with contracts. If you start having self-aware, self-regulatory, self-functioning contracts, that opens up a whole new world. And I don't think blockchain will even exist in isolation. You know, you can think of these use cases now, and I'm not going to make out I'm the brightest person on the planet. When you start putting this into the Internet of Things and where everything else goes, and start putting it in the heart of an ecosystem about how everything could start to be linked together with a blockchain potentially behind the scenes, then you can see the sky's the limit. So I think now it's immature, it's in its infancy, but watch this space 4 or 5 years from now.
But I don't think give up on it, and none of us are advocating that, and I'd say keep trying. So I saw a statistic only earlier this morning that said out of the 100% of innovation and lab-type projects around blockchain in the insurance industry, it's predicted that 90% of them will fail or get terminated. So that sounds like, oh, well, why bother? Well, actually, in that 10%, there could be some really great nuggets. So just to use some examples in insurance claims, it could lend itself to really well. Things like asset management, you know, jewelry, fine art, all of these sorts of things that we would choose to insure. So there's definitely opportunity out there, but it's trying to get that real world perspective and how do you translate it into something that people generally that have worked, certainly in my industry, doing the same sort of thing for the last few hundred years, that's quite a big leap away from where they are now.
So are we saying that really there's gold in them, there disruptions?
There's always gold in disruption.
Yeah, but are the incumbents, are your companies, are your industry, are they the best place to be doing that? Possibly yes, possibly no. What do you think?
I think I think trying to get that type of thinking and that real nugget diving in my industry, in my organisation, probably not. Where I think we should be looking are things like insurtech and fintech that are doing some of that looking and some of that mining, and then capitalise on that. My company's littered with very bright people, but in terms of seeing some of these futures, I think that's very difficult.
I agree. I think from a fintech world, I think there's some great stuff that could be done with blockchain going forward. And it touches on some of the ledger stuff that you've talked about. It's about the asset management, but it's also about customer data, managing customer logins and things like that. So fintech world, absolutely, there's definitely some traction to be gained there. And I think there's going to be a lot of positive results from it.
So there's a lot of big companies, tech companies have always said that their biggest threat was some kid in a garage. Are there any kids that have got garages in here? Well, there must be something like that, right? So there's always something out there to disrupt, and those are the best places, I think, to nurture these ideas, but it needs people like us to understand what's emerging and be able to translate that back into perhaps some of these legacy worlds.
You'll definitely see, certainly in the legal industry, some of the new players on the block, the ones without the traditional trappings, developing products. You may see that stuff bleed from other countries where also the appetite is greater. You're seeing things like land deeds in Latin America using blockchain and places like that. So you'll definitely see it bleeding. I do think with the whole sort of disruption story, it's easy to pick on the one or two Kodaks and things like this. There's an awful lot of big companies that can just wait to be a fast second and have the money and the resources that as soon as something moves, they move with it. They don't need to be first. So.
Thank you. And I think we probably need to, in the view of the time, we probably need to leave it there. But I'd like to thank you, Gareth, Ricky, and Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.